Hello, everyone, and welcome to the August edition of the Seekers Forum. Failure is everything, humility on the spiritual path. I hope you're having a great weekend. Today, we're going to be talking about the value of making mistakes on the path of awakening, regardless of what your chosen practice might be. Whether you're a member of an organized faith or not, it's inevitable that, like all other areas of life, the seeker's path will bring missteps, misunderstandings, false starts, changes of mind and heart, and efforts of all kinds that fail or fall short of expectations. That's because evolution requires error, and the quality that allows us to grow through our mistakes rather than hold on to the lies of the mind is humility. We talk a lot about humility in the Seekers Forum, but it's always worth investigating further if we hope to understand why so called failure matters so much in the awakening process. I ran into this exact roadblock the other day with a student who had sent me a note vehemently rejecting the term humility in a response that I'd sent her after reading a piece of writing. She'd been describing her lifelong inability to forgive herself and other people, trouble accepting her own mistakes and limitations. And I had suggested, as gently as possible, that humility might be the missing link and a solution to her problem. Well, she just absolutely hit the roof. This was somebody who'd been put down since her childhood for not being enough of this or enough of that, and had spent decades constructing a healthy self-regard in therapy. And she was going to be damned, she told me, if she was going to start putting herself down now, as if I was suggesting such a thing. Through the angry ear of her insecure ego, she had heard humility as humiliation and rejected it out of hand. In her mind, self-love and confidence meant standing up for herself at all costs in a hostile world that was intent on taking her down. We talked about how this knee-jerk self-protection had helped her survive a difficult childhood and protect a modicum of self-esteem. And also how this same defensiveness was now threatening to block her personal growth. We discussed the distinction between humiliation, which is all about debasement and mortification, and humility, which is an embodied, lived understanding of our true proportion in relation to the universe. Humiliation is an embodied, lived understanding of our true proportion in relation to the universe. To be humble is to admit that we're merely voices in a vast chorus, supported by a force that is infinitely greater than the limited ego mind. When we struggle to keep our ego intact and mistake who we actually are for this insecure personality that's afraid of being wrong, we identify with a house of cards that's ready to collapse at any moment. This is what I was saying to her. And by the time our conversation was over, she was no more convinced than she had been at the beginning. And yet, it is true that for the insecure ego, anything that threatens its authority is likely to register as humiliation. And that's one reason why inordinate pride or hubris has traditionally been considered a sin or even a tragic flaw, because it conceals our actual dimension in proportion to the universe and thus blinds us to the truth. If you look at almost any problem in human life, any self-defeating pattern or obstacle to growth, you're likely to discover a lack of humility at its core. Whether it's interpersonal suffering, professional suffering, environmental suffering, political suffering, the principle is the same. If you look at a conflict like the civil war in Yemen, for example, where famine has actually been weaponized against innocent people, you can trace its escalation directly to the absence of humility in leaders who are unwilling to admit their mistakes, the absence of humility in politicians who support them in order to get reelected, and even the lack of humility in the collaboration of soldiers who would rather die than suffer the humiliation of refusing to kill. Now, like its emotional sibling gratitude, Humility turns out to be a medicine that cures a great many ills. It's also a powerful inspiration, far more inspiring than pride or grandiosity. When we witness humility in other people, it prompts us to be humble as well. Have you ever noticed that when public figures admit their mistakes, they seem stronger, more trustworthy, more formidable, and not the other way around? Humility is also linked to forgiveness, since both require a willingness to let go of being superior or right. Think of the humility it took for the late Pope John Paul II to forgive the man who tried to assassinate him, or the humility of Pearl Faku and Doreen Magadu, two South African widows who sat down with the apartheid capo who had murdered their husbands. This is an amazing story. During this jailhouse meeting, the women listened to this man who was described as a monster of mythic repute, as he wept about what he had done and begged them for forgiveness. While he spoke, one of the women, Mrs. Faku, found herself reaching out automatically and taking his hand. Afterwards, she was just amazed that she had done such a thing. And this is what she said, quote, "If showing compassion to our enemies is something that our bodies recoil from, what should our attitude be to their cries for mercy?" Unquote. Sitting with this murderer had forced her to admit something that she was not prepared to admit before. She went on to say, quote, "I learned that good and evil exist in all of our lives, and that evil, like good, is always a possibility, and that is what frightened me," unquote. What could be more humble than this, or more noble? It means admitting in those moments when we least want to, that we too are capable of mistakes that we can't imagine, that we too have lied and cheated and attacked and neglected and behaved in all kinds of unvirtuous ways, and that we are not in any position to be judging another at the end of the day. So, does that mean that all things are equal and that we should suspend discernment and condone wrong actions in the name of humility or forgiveness? Of course not. But when our minds are cleared of pride, we're able to see more clearly and drop our favorite ego shields, which are self-righteousness and superiority. Self-righteousness and superiority distort our perceptions and skew our judgment. Until we realize that failure and mistakes are actually teachers and guides to be thankful for, not enemies to conceal or resist, we miss how evolution actually works. As seekers on a path of awakening, we are called on to be both radically humble and unflinching in our discernment. Both radically humble and unflinching in our discernment. Because we're aware of our own limitations. We no longer harbor so many illusions. Nor do we divide the world into good and bad, black and white, quite so methodically. This is a challenging shift because the ego tends to see in opposites, either or, black, white, wrong, right, valuable, useless. And often we either judge or demean other people or aggrandize them and put them on pedestals, one of the two. And that's because the average ego, which is simplistic and quite obtuse, has a difficult time tolerating contradiction, inconsistency, paradox, or fallibility. These qualities may be universal, but they throw a kind of wrench into the ego's primitive works, which function to peg people inside the social order in order to see where we fit. This is also why, in an effort to fit in and not make mistakes, people very often reject their most unique, original, contradictory qualities in the process of quote unquote growing up. When our gifts don't fit into the one-dimensional image that this simple-minded ego is attached to, we'd rather deny them and stick to the edited version of ourselves, no matter how unhappy or mediocre or deluded it might be. Then allow our disparate parts out of the box, out of the shadow, and risk growing into something new. So ask yourself, where is humility lacking in you? How do you not allow yourself to make mistakes or admit them and learn from them once they're made? How is a lack of humility connected to the inability to forgive? And where does the need to be right preclude the ability to be happy? Do you discard the gifts you've been given because they require humility or vulnerability or a willingness to enter the unknown? And does this block your creativity as well, which requires risk as the price of admission? These same questions apply to intimate relationships, to meaningful work, to service in the world, as well as to our spiritual lives, because they all require us to learn humility and realize that trial and error is the only way that we move forward and expand our dimension. So let's look more closely at each of these four areas as they relate to humility and the willingness to grow beyond what we know, starting with intimate relationships. Have you ever wondered why it's virtually impossible to have a conscious, mutually beneficial relationship with a narcissist, for example? Whether we're talking about a family member, a friend, a lover, a coworker, or a community member, narcissism is anathema to intimacy. If we define intimacy loosely as the ability to be authentic and present, unguarded, sensitive, and connectable with, and we define narcissism as the condition of being contrived, self-enclosed, defended, unaware of other people's feelings, and hard to bond with, it becomes obvious why these two are so disconnected. While most of us aren't pathological narcissists, we exist as egotistical beings on a spectrum of ordinary narcissism, caught up in our own reflections, enclosed in the self-image within our own minds. Whether we tend toward so-called positive narcissism or negative narcissism, emotional intimacy is equally compromised. I see this as a teacher very often with folks who suffer from negative narcissism, who defend their self-hating version of things and fight off all evidence to the contrary. Just try telling someone who's determined to feel bad about themselves that they're nowhere near as terrible as they think. And you'll see, they'll bite your head off. They will fight you tooth and nail. And that's because there is no genuine humility in the negative narcissist. They're too caught up in self-humiliation. Being trapped in this obsession with themselves, they are just as emotionally unavailable in relationship as the self-worshiping person is. So ask yourself, how does narcissism, an infatuation with your own self-image, show up in your own life, either positively in the form of arrogance, grandiosity, or vanity, or negatively in the form of self-hatred, compulsive shame, or doormat-type self-abasement? How does a distorted self-image interfere with your ability to connect and belong? How does resistance to admitting mistakes undermine trust and humility and self-awareness? Looking at the relationship between narcissism and intimacy, and humility and narcissism is very useful on the spiritual path. Next, let's turn to the role of mistake-making and humility in creating and enjoying meaningful work. It takes humility to tolerate the slow, often invisible process of waiting for our real work to appear. A friend of mine calls it waiting for his assignment from God. The only thing that the ego mind likes less than not being in control is having to wait for life to reveal itself in its own time. Lack of patience and lack of trust can often sabotage our best intentions when we fail to understand the nature of process as it relates to our own unfolding. The mind tends to move in leaps and bounds and likes to imagine progress as a linear path, rather than a winding trail to a dark wood that's full of turnarounds and confusing cul-de-sacs. The path of discovering one's work can be more like a labyrinth than a 100-yard dash. As with human intimacy, we're called on to be open, alert, sensitive, and flexible. We learn to read the signs, follow our hunches, and surrender the need for certainty. If we can't be humble, we can't learn new things. And if we can't learn new things, we can't remain devoted to meaningful work as it unfolds. So ask yourself, how does humility affect your ability to listen for life's cues and follow your vocation or destiny as it's revealed to you? How do competition, pride, and insecurity interfere with this deep listening? How does the need to be in control, call the shots, and predict the future sabotage the quality of your life? That's an important question. Are there things that you're called to do that seem beneath you, for example? And if so, what might you be missing? Now let's move on to the relationship between humility and public service, which may overlap with your meaningful work or not. Confronted by the enormity of suffering in the world, it's easy to shrink back in powerlessness, to throw up our hands and say, why bother? If we can't make significant lasting change and be super effective as public servants, maybe it's better to just keep to ourselves, we think. To enter the fray of public service in light of the world's colossal problems is a consummate act of humility. I've heard people say, I don't feel worthy of public service. What do I know? How could I help? I can't even help myself. But this often stems from an inverted grandiosity. We're more comfortable shrinking ourselves into powerlessness than revealing ourselves as ordinary, limited, human-sized creatures who probably won't make a lasting difference, but who dare to fail anyway. As our lives become more complex and challenging, the future of the world will depend on our ability to show up in whatever small way we can. We don't need to be heroes in order to help. We just need to stop thinking so much about ourselves. So ask yourself, how is humility related to your ability to serve others and the world? Do pride or perfectionism interfere with how you engage with the world's problems? If no one will ever know you helped, are you still willing to do your part? And what about self-righteousness? Does it get in the way of seeing both sides, having compassion, reaching across aisles, connecting where the need is? These are very important questions to explore as seekers who want to be engaged with the world and its needs. And finally, let's turn to the topic of humility as it relates directly to spiritual life. Many people enter a spiritual path hoping to feel better about themselves, to heal their suffering, to feel less alone, to know themselves as children of God. They imagine that spiritual life means progressing from level to level, from revelation to revelation, in a steady move toward holiness or enlightenment. The last thing that most seekers want is self-confrontation, radical truth-telling, disillusionment, or deflation in the form of ego death, which is what spiritual life is actually about. They certainly don't want to feel more pain, which is also what happens with awakening. The more enlightened you are, the more you see. The more you see, the more you feel. And the more you feel, the harder it becomes to deny the pain and suffering and difficulties of this world. The good news is that our capacity for empathy and pain is matched by an increased capacity for joy in spiritual life. The more we orient toward the spiritual, the less this suffering becomes about us. When we make mistakes, we don't lash ourselves or feel crestfallen. That's just an ego trip. When we have big breakthroughs, on the other hand, we don't praise ourselves and get up on a soapbox. I remember a life-changing moment at a meditation retreat many decades ago. I was feeling miserable because my sittings were just going so badly. I wanted so much to become a good meditator, to still my mind, to be able to sit like a Buddha. But the truth is that my legs ached, my back ached, my head was a mess, and I was hating nearly every minute of this endless retreat. One day I was talking about all of this to an older woman who had been meditating for many years. And when I finished my tirade, She just smiled and asked me very simply why I didn't just sit in a chair. It was one of those ego popping moments when you realize how attached you are to an idealized image in your head. She said, "You may never be a master meditator, but you can learn to love how you do your practice." And those words changed my life. You can become so fond of it, she said, that it stays with you through good times and bad and remains an ally no matter what happens. So after that, I let myself sit in a chair, and 30 years later, I still enjoy sitting. But before this could happen, I needed to stop trying to get somewhere, become somebody, and risk a little humility. So ask yourself, how does lack of humility interfere with your practice or faith? Where does spiritual materialism, the ego that attaches to spiritual life, block the arising of wisdom? Do you harbor images of yourself as a saint in the making, a master in disguise, a bearer of very, very special gifts, the power of which the world scarcely knows? The crazy wisdom teacher Da Friedjon once said that most seekers are just Narcissus in drag. Now, that's a harsh and only partly true remark, but it does deserve consideration. With an ongoing practice of humility and radical truth-telling, it's possible to avoid the pitfalls of spiritual hubris and see ourselves for what we are: unique, miraculous children of God, children of this divine creation, with no need to aggrandize ourselves or puff ourselves up, because we're more than enough already. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about making mistakes and humility on the spiritual path. And now, Jay, let's open up the lines and have some conversation. So, folks, I'm curious to know, have you run into an absence of humility on your own spiritual path? And how has that affected your ability to persevere? Do you find that you need to feel a certain, that your confidence is connected to pride, or is your confidence connected to humility? That's a really important distinction. Anybody want to share your personal experience?